Good evening, this is Ted Staver, and today we're going to talk about the Guadalcanal campaign, the first campaign in World War II. We will begin by exploring how the Japanese and American navies and the U.S. Marines envisioned fighting the next Great War during the interwar period of 1919 to 1940. Then we will examine the first year of the war in the Pacific to gain an understanding why it did not turn out how the Japanese and Americans had envisioned it in their pre-war planning. Following the Russo-Japanese War, both Japan and the U.S. came to view the other as the most likely enemy in any future war in Asia and the Pacific. The Japanese believed that the key to their national survival and greatness rested on their ability to secure the vital natural resources in China, French Indochina, Malaysia, and the Dutch East Indies. They understood that seizing these assets would not only entail a war with Britain, France, and the Netherlands, but also with the United States, as the Philippines island constituted a major obstacle to any Japanese drive to the south. The leaders of the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Marine Corps understood that their greatest challenge was projecting and sustaining combat power across the Pacific and developed their strategic concepts and technological innovations with that in mind. Their overall plan was a drive starting on the West Coast and through Hawaii and through the Central Pacific to the Philippines with an ultimate destination of the seas around Japan. Much like their Japanese peers, U.S. Navy planners envisioned that the war would be decided by a decisive naval battle in Japanese waters. The Japanese were well aware that they lacked the resources to fight a long attritional battle against the greatest industrial power in the world, and that the U.S. Navy outnumbered their own. The Japanese, they knew, however, that the U.S. would face great challenges in sustaining its operations across the vast Pacific Ocean. As such, the Japanese Navy envisioned fighting an interception and attrition strategy in the Pacific, which consisted of the following tenets. Japan planned to use the Japanese mandates, a series of former German territories from New Guinea to the Mariana Islands, which they had gained after World War I, as forward operating bases. The Japanese Navy planned to intercept and track U.S. naval forces sailing from the West Coast and Hawaii using a submarine screen. The submarines would sink as many U.S. combatant ships as possible, harass the U.S. fleet throughout its passage, and continually update the Japanese fleet on the progress and strength of the Americans. The Japanese planned to use the carrier aviation to further attrit the U.S. fleet. As the Americans sailed through the islands of the Japanese mandate, land-based aviation would continue to whittle away the American strength. When the depleted U.S. fleet entered Japanese waters, the Japanese anticipated that the combat ratio between the two fleets would be roughly equal. The Japanese Navy envisioned that the war against the U.S. would culminate like the decisive naval battle of Tomisha fought in the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. Japan maintained their qualitative advantages in technology, training, and national spirit would lead to their victory in the sea engagement. The war would end in a negotiated settlement in their mind. To give them the war that they wanted, in the interwar period, the Japanese Navy invested in long-range submarines, lethal torpedoes, carrier aviation, and super dreadnoughts, in other words, big battleships. And they also instituted tough and realistic training to give their forces asymmetrical advantages over their enemies in night fighting and aerial combat. Their hope was that the Japanese quality would overcome American quantity. While the Japanese believed that the war would end in a negotiation, the American strategy was centered on economic strangulation from the sea. By first defeating the Japanese fleet, then enforcing a blockade of the Japanese mainland that would ultimately force the Japanese to sue for peace. Those tenets of the U.S. naval strategy highlighted would be the U.S. Navy knew that it would have to seize the strongly fortified Japanese Mandate Islands to secure logistics bases for continued power projection and to deny the Japanese the means of interdicting American lines of communication. In 1919, Chief of Naval Operations directed Marine Corps Commandant John Lejeune to begin planning for amphibious operations in the Central Pacific to secure logistics bases for a war with Japan, despite the conventional wisdom after the 1915 Gallipoli campaign that attacks against defended beaches would become bloody debacles. Like Japan, the U.S. Navy also sought into innovations to achieve their vision of the next war. Fearful of Japan's growing air threats and the fact that their operations could generally not be supported by U.S. Army air assets, the U.S. Navy placed ever greater emphasis on carrier aviation and long-range submarines during the interwar period. But still, the U.S. Navy continued to view the battleship as the key combatant of their fleet. To extend the reach of the fleet, the U.S. Navy also perfected the difficult task of supply and fuel replenishment while underway. Furthermore, the U.S. Navy pushed to field radar sets on its ships to aid in fire control and detection of enemy forces. Despite the interwar planning by both Japan and the U.S., as tensions grew, new events required both sides to adjust their strategies. An oil embargo imposed on Japan by the U.S. on 26 July 1941 caused Japan to rethink their approach to a possible conflict with the West. The U.S. had also awoken to the increasing possibility of a war with the Axis powers and Japan, specifically in the Pacific. Surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. In an effort to seize the resources it needed to fight a modern war and to cut down the Americans' growing naval superiority, on 7 December 1941, the Japanese attacked the American fleet at Pearl Harbor and simultaneously struck American, British, and Dutch possessions in Asia and the Pacific. The more optimistic voices inside the Japanese military believed that these strikes would quickly force the Western powers to negotiate. Others believed that expanding the Japanese defensive perimeter would at least give them the space and time to execute the interception and attrition strategy. Unfortunately for the Japanese, they underestimated the resolve of the Western powers and the anger that their attacks would generate in the U.S. Far from setting the conditions for a short war and a negotiated peace, the Japanese attacks hardened America's will while only temporarily hobbling the ability of the U.S. to wage war. Americans get caught by surprise. Although War Plan Orange accepted the likely loss of the Philippines, the size, scope, and audacity of the Japanese attacks caught the Americans by surprise. The rapid loss of Guam, Wake Island, and the Philippines, and the destruction of American naval power in the Pacific also threw the American plans into disarray. The German and Italian declarations of war against the U.S. in the wake of Pearl Harbor committed the U.S. to fighting a global war. After the fall of France in 1940, Franklin Roosevelt and the U.S. Joint Chiefs decided upon a Germany First strategy for any future war in both Europe and the Pacific. This, along with the loss of much of the Pacific Fleet and the time it was taken to mobilize the nation for war, meant that the first year of the war of the U.S. in the Pacific would be fought on a shoestring. American military leaders now understood that defeating Japan was going to be a matter of years and began to plan accordingly. Imperial Japanese Navy SINC Commander-in-Chief Combined Fleet Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto pushed for an attack on the Aleutians and Midway to force the U.S. Navy to fight to protect Hawaii and the West Coast. This led to the Battle of Midway, which was a major defeat of the Japanese Navy. Midway was fought on 4 June 1942 and resulted in the loss of 4 of their 6 Japanese fleet carriers. This put pressure on High Command to regain the initiative in the Pacific and again refocused the Japanese on completing their capture of New Guinea and pushing forward to Fiji and Samoa. And I note, Guadalcanal was not a priority. One of the major strategic problems for the Japanese was a lack of inter-service trust and cooperation. To illustrate this, during the interwar period, conflicts over foreign policy, strategy, and budget led to clashes between the Army and the Navy that culminated in the assassination of high-ranking government officials. This rivalry and lack of any official body akin to the U.S. Joint Chiefs that regulated the apportionment of military resources and directed military strategy hobbled Japanese operations throughout the entire war. The Japanese challenges on Guadalcanal. The 1st Marine Division conducted its first assault on Guadalcanal on 8 August 1942. Because the Japanese Navy initially downplayed the size of the American forces on Guadalcanal, the 17th Japanese Army at first only sent a small force, the Akechi Detachment, to push the Americans off the island. This lack of communication led to the piecemeal flow of Japanese forces and supplies to the island and gave the U.S. time to consolidate its foothold on Guadalcanal in the first months of the battle. By the time the Japanese realized the seriousness of the situation on Guadalcanal, the Americans had already put Henderson Field into operation. The American foothold thus forced the Japanese to change their operational focus. Specifically, Japan's 17th Army went on the defense in New Guinea, even though it was close to capturing the key town of Port Moresby, which was forced it to divert forces to Guadalcanal. Without much forethought, the Japanese, Guadalcanal became the focus of their efforts in the South and Central Pacific and consumed increasing amounts of irreplaceable troops and materials. Both sides were fighting an unanticipated battle at the edge of their logistical and operational reach, where neither could isolate the battlefield in a strategic environment of limited men and material. Additionally, they were fighting in an unforgiving tropical climate that is especially wet and humid and hot, and the island contained a number of swamps and other stagnant watercourses that were conducive to a host of tropical diseases, especially malaria, where non-combat casualties outnumbered combat wounds 8-1. In such attritional struggles, victory generally goes to the side that can continue to feed resources into the fight while inflicting losses on the enemy that surpasses its ability to reconstitute its forces relative to one's own. That is a classic definition of attrition warfare. In summary, the war envisioned in pre-war planning was nothing like the war that was fought. No great decisive sea battle, not a war of super dreadnoughts or battleships deciding the day. Instead, it was a grinded out war of attrition, of island hopping that began in Guadalcanal, and the aircraft carrier became the decisive combatant and the battleship was relegated to a supporting role. Yet the campaign illustrated one of the central tenets of the American way of war, the ability to project and sustain forces, firepower over vast distances.